Hello, happy Monday and happy day after Easter. I hope everyone had, even in these bizarre conditions, a good holiday weekend and everybody enjoyed the fact that classes ended at 1 o'clock on Friday. So there was no video for this class specifically, and any others that might have been canceled for you. Um, this week is my last chance to address a specific topic, and I'm going to spend it thinking about cities and the environment. Um, Cities often seem and are framed as the absolute antithesis of environmentalism, and that is just not true. There's just no way in which that argument is supported by data. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that cities can be, as Mike Davis puts it, the ark that saves humanity from climate catastrophe, that cities are the greatest hope that we have for a cleaner, more sustainable future in whatever climate reality we end up facing as a society. Okay. What's kind of interesting about this is if you ask me off the record, what is the greatest threat to global stability over the next century? My answer would be climate change. And so here's a topic that I would say is the single most important thing facing humanity over the next century. And I buried it in the last week of class. And there's a lot of other ways in which this happens as well. Like I remember watching casually the presidential debates from several months back, and it was often like questions about the environment and environmental policy would often be asked in the debates, but they would always come after like the third or the fourth commercial break. So it's like, hey, here is the biggest threat facing our species, and let's put it at the end of the debate, right? It's kind of like saying, well, my house is on, it's kind of like thinking about uh, whether or not you should retile your bathroom while your house is on fire. So perhaps the way I have chosen to treat this and bury it in like a future issue or future issues of the city is very reflective of a social attitude that is not particularly helpful. Nevertheless, I do want to spend this whole week talking about cities and the environment. So let's start with the discussion of what has happened. The 20th century, like when the 20th century ended, the world was pretty much unrecognizable from what it looked like at the start of the 20th century. Human society, though, despite all these technological changes and the ability that we have to influence the environment. Despite all of that, let's not lose sight of the fact that human society from the very beginning has always been shaped by environmental factors. In fact, you will remember that when I was doing a week all the way back in January about urban theory, I gave you the POET model, this idea of population, organization, environment, and technology. So environment is one of the four core points that classical urban theory looks to understand why cities look the way they do and why they take the form that they ultimately end up taking. Our species and the social organization that we create has always been influenced by the environment. So just running through, I want you to think a little bit about what is it that we need from the environment to have a society in the first place, like just for society to even be able to function. We obviously need things like water. We clearly need fresh water. We need plentiful wildlife for a variety of reasons, diversity of social species and symmetry within the natural world is often looked at by ecologists as a major factor in the determining of a healthy ecosystem. We need protections from extremes. People don't generally do well living in horribly hot environments like Ohio, and people also don't do well living in horribly cold environments, also like Ohio. And we need arable land. We need the land to be able to give us something, to be able to use the land for our own benefit. These are all things that we've been able to take for granted in postmodern society. So, yeah, we need fresh water, except Phoenix is home to several million people in the metro area and has none of it. We need plentiful wildlife, except species are going extinct in unheard of numbers, and everything just seems fine when I open the window of my apartment. We need protections from extremes, except there's massive population growth in one of the hottest parts of the world in the Middle East and North Africa. And we need protection from extremes, except when you consider that some of the stablest places on Earth actually have relatively high population densities and some of the healthiest societies, thinking about Scandinavia, for example. So maybe not. We need arable land, except when you consider that the largest cities in the world essentially produce none of their own food, but bring it in from the hinterlands. And so what that shows you, urban society allows us to mitigate these risks. The city as a mutual support pact allows us to say, all right, even if we don't have fresh water, even if we don't have plentiful wildlife, even if we don't have protection from extremes, even if we don't have arable land, a functional and thriving city is still possible. Until, of course, it's not possible anymore. All right. So urban society, it mitigates these collective risks that we all face, and it limits our exposure to these environmental risks. But it can also transform both the society that we're a part of and the natural world that that society is placed within. And not enough is really thought about that, about this give and take relationship between cities and the environment. Now, as far as what is happening right now, humans have the single largest impact on the global environment of any species on Earth. There's two things that I would argue are unquestionably true about human beings. One is that we impact the environment of the whole planet in a way no other species can. But I would also argue our behavior and our actions are more flexible and malleable than any other species on Earth. We can plan ahead and plan in advance in a way that almost no other species can. We can adjust our behavior and create new cultural realities depending on the social structure around us, like almost nobody else can. So going into the 21st century, I also feel pretty safe predicting that the end of the 21st century will look almost nothing like the beginning of the 21st century. Population continues to grow year over year, but it's driven almost entirely by poor countries and non-urban countries. So currently, there's about 7.2 billion people that call planet Earth home. That is projected to rise to somewhere around 11 to 12 billion before eventually falling into decline and plateauing around 9.5 billion. So population is going to plateau. But just a cursory look at the developing countries throughout the world shows you that wealth and consumption probably will not. We're not going to condemn Nigeria to be poor forever. We are not going to condemn Mali to be poor forever. India and China will likely continue to build their middle class. Maybe Russia will turn their demographic catastrophe around at some point and start getting a lot wealthier and more egalitarian. Each country's situation is a little unique, but you add it up and every country wants to grow from a wealth perspective. And they can only do that in a capitalist economy by consuming. Okay, so there's two paradigms for trying to understand environmental sociology. The first is what's known as human exemptionalism. This is an idea that I've kind of referenced already, that yeah, humans have the biggest impact, but humans are also one of the most creative species, and we are one of the most adaptable species. So notice how this doesn't say exceptionalism. It doesn't say that we're different, really. It says that we are going to be exempt from these changes because our ability to create new technologies, our ability to adapt our behaviors will allow us to stay in front of whatever the worst of climate change ends up being. This argument's seductive to me in a lot of ways, I have to admit. And I think quietly, a lot of people assume that, yeah, climate change is definitely happening. And yeah, it's going to transform our society. But like, even if the average temperatures of London start to look like the average temperatures of Cairo right now, hey, British society will find a way to exist in those somewhat barren conditions. And maybe instead of getting wheat from Kansas, we'll just get it from like Winnipeg and Calgary at that point. There will be a movement of the population away from the temperate areas into what are now very cold, currently very cold areas. And things will generally go on. Everything will be different, but things will generally be the same, if you understand what I mean by that. The other side to this, which I may, even though I find human exemptionalism to be seductive, deep ecology comes a lot closer to probably reflecting what my viewpoint actually is, though, despite the attractiveness of human exemptionalism to me. And so the idea behind deep ecology is that you are talking about an era of human civilization that's only about 5,000 to 10,000 years, depending on how far back you want to go. And that represents, in the time frame of planet Earth, a fraction of a percent of the time that the planet has been around. And our society has evolved. It is known in a period of unusually stable climate conditions. And it might be possible to say that our society will go on and our species will go on if those conditions radically change. But that strikes me as an awfully risky gamble to take, an awfully risky gamble to take. So the idea behind deep ecology is that our society evolved under specific environmental conditions. If you change those conditions, there's no telling where you end up, right? Like if you follow the climate models, you get a different climate. But if you follow the social structures, you don't know where you're going to end up because there's no data point for understanding what society would look like under those conditions that haven't been observed during a time period in which humans have been on Earth in such broad numbers, okay? So that leads me to a discussion on urbanization. Like just talking about deep ecology, I could go a million different directions with that, right? We could talk about fossil fuels, we could talk about energy use, we could talk about a variety of things, but this class is about cities and urban life, so I want to talk about cities and urban life. More immediately, if I could make a third prediction about the future, it is that the pace of urbanization is increasing at breakneck speed, and there is absolutely no reason to believe that that will stop being true. Like even as the virus, the current pandemic, continues to ravage America's densest cities and some of Europe's densest cities, I still feel that this is the way of the world. It's the modal way of life. And there's very little evidence that I can see that that will stop being true. Like we're not going to go back to the land en masse. 53% of the world is currently living in cities. If you look at a place like our country, 80% of Americans live in or near a city, so in an urban or a suburban area. By 2050, 75% of the world is projected to be living within a city. This is no longer just a way of life. It's the way of life. There is no longer such a thing as urban sociology. It's just sociology. There's no such thing as urban sociology because the majority of us live in or around urban areas. Therefore, the conditions of the city, the politics of the city, the economies of the city are the conditions that the majority of us are going to have to live in, and they are therefore the modal conditions of the world, okay? What that tells me, the fact that 75% of the people are going to be living in cities by 2050, that's where our consumption is going to be happening. That's where our social activity is going to be happening. That is where our politics are going to be focused on. The fight against climate change, I argue, is going to be either won or lost depending on what happens in cities. It is going to be won or lost depending on what happens at the level of urban policy. Not to put too much pressure on those of you that want to be urban planners, but this is the place. The planning of cities will be the planning of society, and the planning of society will dictate what climate looks like, what our oceans look like, what our air looks like, what everything looks like in 2050. Okay, so the fight against, to reiterate my point here, whether we win or whether we lose this war against climate change, in this war to save ourselves, that is going to be played out, that will be fought on urban battlegrounds, and it will be won or lost within the cities of our planet Earth. So then let's talk a bit about how cities can contribute to that, because that's really the point here. I think you can see that that's where this is building. Cities may seem the opposite of environmentalism, but as I said at the start of this lecture, that's not true at all. People use fewer resources in cities per capita. Really? Yeah, apparently. People use resources more efficiently in cities. People have to travel shorter distances for between to connect supply and demand of anything that you might want to access. But let's not also pretend that even though cities are generally one of the friendliest things to an environment, they also get people out of nature, where generally what we do when we go into nature is fuck it up. If you love nature, my advice to you is don't go into it, leave it alone, and stay within cities so you can let it be. Cities not only are they environmental, they're also adaptable. They're things that we can change, and they can take different forms. So you can see from this picture, this is clearly not a very environmentally friendly city. This is Los Angeles, or one stretch of freeway in a very car-dependent, sprawling city. So while my argument is that cities are environmentally friendly, and I'll show some examples of what that looks like in practice, it's very clear that cities can produce a larger ecological footprint than they would otherwise have to do. Look no further than Southern California urbanism, where everything is spread out, everybody packs themselves into their car, everybody's burning gasoline, smog is choking the Los Angeles air. LA is a clear city of how urban planning and social consumption patterns increasing the ecological footprint of the city. On the other hand, this is Amsterdam, one of the most ecologically friendly, one of the greenest cities on Earth. So cities can work to reduce that ecological footprint. So if you go to the Netherlands, you will see far fewer cars than you're used to seeing, even in a place like Detroit. More people there, but fewer cars. They live in very dense urban neighborhoods. The Dutch ride their bikes everywhere. It's actually a law in the Netherlands that if you have a job, your employer needs to buy you a bicycle once every 3 years. That's a law, and people use it. Not only that, they have a culture of biking. They have a culture. They have an urban structure that allows that to happen. Right? People are living a lot closer to their places of work, so biking to work is reasonable and realistic enough. And they have all sorts of dedicated bike lanes. They have areas of their cities, especially in major cities like The Hague, Amsterdam, and Rotterdam, where it's illegal to drive. They don't have a lot of parking, and they have a lot of places to leave a bicycle. It's like a look at the future. It's like a look at what our country will hopefully look like in 10 years. I say hopefully, that's obviously my personal opinion. And that's just, that's my bias as what I like out of the city. Those two examples, Amsterdam, Netherlands, and Los Angeles, California, they're examples of the city as a system. We have to use the city in order to live our lives. It's not just a place where things happen. And to repeat something I've said a few times now, cities are more than just the sum of their real estate deals. And so when it comes to environmentalism specifically, I favor what is known as a systems approach. So thinking of the city as a system, think of what any type of system in a chemical or like a physical sense would imply. Inputs, what do you got to put into the system? Process, how do you have to run the system? And outputs, what is put out, what comes out of that process. And progress can be made in all three areas. There's no one way in which cities will become green, but a variety of input, process, and output on-the-ground policy that can add up to urban sustainability. But let's not pretend that this is a smooth process. It can easily go wrong, and you end up with Los Angeles. All right? So inputs, processes, and outputs. If you have LA or an unsustainable city, Here's what that would look like. That's a system that's operating with very high level of inputs. That is, they use a lot of resources. It does not satisfy our needs, e.g., congestion, poor air quality, Los Angeles and Los Angeles times two. And it produces a large amount of waste and pollution, right? So it's a lot of inputs, inefficient use of those inputs, and inability to account for the outputs in an ecologically friendly way. On the other hand, if I look at Amsterdam, reduced level of inputs, right? Fewer cars, a lot less gasoline, things like that. Also, the Europeans don't really use air conditioning very frequently. And the Netherlands is a cool country. It's not a cold country, it's a cool country. So look, I mean, they get heat waves like anybody else in the summer, but it's generally a pretty mild place and they don't need a ton of air conditioning. Satisfies our needs with a good quality of life. Amsterdam has very low levels of pollution, very low levels of crime, very high levels of wealth and education, very high levels of social solidarity. So Amsterdam, and 90% of Amsterdam residents are living in rent-controlled apartments, so you don't really have to stress about that whole thing. And it just doesn't produce a lot of waste and pollution. So how do we make the world more like Amsterdam and less like Los Angeles? That's the question. And I will admit that my traveling experiences are mostly like most of the parts of the world that I've seen is just multiple countries in Europe, right? But I have been to India, right? Like, so I've done the kind of developing country thing as well a little bit. There's an emerging belief, and I buy it for the record, that cities of the developing world of Southeast Asia, Latin America, India, China, they are coming to reflect Los Angeles much more than reflecting Northern Europe. And that is a big, big, big problem. But the reason why LA developed the way it did is the same reason why Mumbai is developing the way that it is. And that's a problem I will return to at a later point. So to review here, inputs are what you need to run the city as a system. The process is how that system runs, and outputs are what is a byproduct of running that system. This can produce sustainability or unsustainability. I don't know, but I think you get the point. Okay, so moving on from that, let's talk about inputs. Inputs, I've said, are what are the resources a city needs and will consume? In other words, like, how much do you need to ensure a high standard of life? The location of cities and its population size very much matters here. So I'm just going to look at one example here. US average residential air conditioning expenditures by climate region in 2015. In cold or very cold areas, only 5% of total home energy expenditures is air conditioning. Why am I using air conditioning as the example? Air conditioning is one of the worst things for the planet. It's incredibly inefficient. Also, we can have a 72-degree living room in the dead of summer. So the Midwest, the Northeast is really not the problem here. They don't use a lot of air conditioning. And I've lived in Michigan a few years now. July is really the only hot month. I can tell you, I currently live in an apartment. I live in a building that does not have air conditioning. I haven't missed it once, really. Like, even the heat waves don't go on that long, where like I'm very much okay having like to deal with that during the summer, because it's such a short period anyway. Then compare that to another state that I live, North Carolina, in the mixed humid area, 2.5 times greater expenditure on of home energy percentage on air conditioning. Florida, Texas, the part of Georgia that Atlanta is in, all of a sudden that's up to 27%. Florida seems nice, and it's only livable because people can air condition themselves. And like I have been to both Houston and Dallas in the month of June. Everything you do during the day, it's just a trip between air-conditioned areas, right? Leave an air-conditioned house, get into an air-conditioned car, go to an air-conditioned office. these cities demand that just for them to be livable in the first place. Then you look at the mixed dry parts of California and then coastal California and the West Coast. Beautiful weather there. 2% in these marine areas on the West Coast. 2%. They just don't need to use a lot of it. So part of this shows you what areas are destined to be a little ecologically unsustainable as long as we want to have a cool living room in the middle of July. But it also shows you what the resources we could stand to cut back on are. 20% of the USA's CO2 is from residential use, electricity, heating, and cooling. Another 20% is from motor vehicles. Here's the problem. The cities that are the hottest and demand the most air conditioning are usually the most sprawled out, and they demand the most gasoline consumption. So we're dividing the country kind of into a very high ecological footprint and a low ecological footprint. And that becomes very, very problematic. So how do we reduce the inputs? That's the idea, to create a sustainable city. How do we reduce the inputs? Okay, well, if there was perhaps a way to reduce air conditioning, right, that would certainly be helpful. But as long as people are going to live in Florida, those cities are destined to use a tremendous amount of air conditioning. There's just almost nothing more that you can do there. That being said, if I look at the cities in the Northeast and in the Midwest, that's where our climate policy, in California as well, I should put California and Pacific Northwest, that's where progress is very much being made in terms of reduction of emissions. So an example of how this might work in progress, so I should say a sustainable city is going to use much more renewable inputs, right? Like, so to finish that thought, I guess I never really finished that out. We're going to have to think about how to use renewable energy sources to cool Texas and Florida cities, or to help people get around North Carolina cities, which are disgustingly sprawled out as well. An example here is Boston. Boston is not the nation's greenest city, but it is the city that actually leads the nation in renewable energy use. Right now, it's not hippy-dippy Portland. It's not really rich San Francisco. No, it's Boston. Boston is a leader in this in a lot of ways. For starters, it's very dense. It was laid out well before the car was invented, and so its urban form reflects that it's got to be denser. People for a long time in Boston were limited to how far they could walk, and then it was limited to public transportation, and then it became about the car. But Boston has also implemented a ton of building regulations, just on the ground level. Like, if you build one building that's going to be much more efficient with water, gas, and electrical usage, that alone does not save a city. But if you do all your new buildings in that way, then all of a sudden the city starts to look much greener than it ever would have been. And so Boston's been a real leader on this, with wind energy, renewable energy, all sorts of things that they can tap into that do not involve fossil fuel consumption and don't require people to drive incredibly long distances to get in from the suburbs. So I hope you see what is meant by inputs here, like the method of generating energy. In most cities, wind is not super realistic yet, but that could very well be changing. One of the big problems with wind is it's kind of inefficient to store it, essentially, because energy has to be transmitted. And so with something like oil or coal, you can put it in a barrel and carry it somewhere. But with wind, you're sort of limited to where it is. And within cities, you can do wind turbines, and Boston has done that quite a bit, but they don't usually get built in cities. But this might change. If they become more efficient, then I would expect to see sustainable cities going the wind route and going the hydroelectric route going forward as well. Water tends to be the most common way in which cities can generate renewable energy, and Boston does that too. All right. So now, turning our attention to process. This is about how people get around, what people do in a city. I feel like a broken record at this point, but how dense and how sprawled an area is the primary driver of the urban processes here. So Electric consumption and transportation, I have said on the previous slide or 2 slides ago, they are the primary driver of CO2 emissions. They're a primary way in which we burn all this crap out. Take a look at how some of these US cities compare to Australian cities and European cities. Canadian cities tend to be less dense and more sprawled than European cities, but far less so than their other friends and neighbors in North America. If you see what you're seeing on this graph here, the x-axis is area per person. It's kind of a measure how sprawled out things are, and gasoline per person is on my y-axis. It's a clear correlation here. Europeans live in dense areas and they use very little gasoline. Also, Europeans tax the shit out of it too, which is worth mentioning. In Europe, people are always complaining about gas prices, and we have no right to do that, ever. I realize that the price of oil is absolutely cratered right now as a result of this, the virus-induced recession. But at the same time, even if gas was $4 a gallon, you're still getting a deal on it. They're spending, if you do the conversions to metric and other currencies, Germans, the Swiss, the Czechs, they're paying $6 to $8 a gallon on gasoline. And it shows, right? It very much shows in terms of the way that the society has been set up there. Then you look at Phoenix and Houston, other US cities, they're more sprawled out, and not surprisingly, people have to drive more. They use more gasoline. So what cities do, I cannot stress this enough, even though I think you guys are pretty willing to come in on this argument. Not only do they cut down on distance traveled, but they also cut down on electric usage. A big reason for this is the size of the living environment. What does it take more energy to do per capita? To heat your studio apartment in New York or Boston, or to heat, in the dead of winter, or to heat your 5-bedroom apartment in the Houston suburbs? Or air conditioned, to, I guess, use a better, a more Texas associated example. So our denser living and the way that we get around here, the process there and how you use those resources, we can use resources for a productive economy, or we can use it to just live comfortably in large sprawled environments where we drive all the time. One of those is going to be more sustainable going forward than others. All right. So to give you a couple examples of this, obviously this is leading towards the city that I would consider to be my hometown or closest to my hometown. New York. New York shows you that you can have a large, wealthy population and be a very green city. In fact, New York, believe it or not, is the greenest, most ecologically sustainable city in the entire country. It's pretty much the only city in the United States that somewhat approximates what the Europeans are doing. So despite the fact that there's a whole lot of people that need to consume in New York, and despite the fact that those people have a lot of resources to consume, they actually consume less, and they do so more efficiently, because they don't have to travel as much and they don't have to spend as much on the structures that they are living in. This is obviously leading toward the discussion about public transportation. Well over 50% of New York City residents get to work on public transportation. That's like 4% in many other cities. So the nation, if we tried to price this out, the average carbon footprint per person, so this is you and me and everybody, the average carbon footprint is 19 tons of CO2, right? 19 tons of CO2 per person, annualized. That's what you're responsible for. And that's everybody from New York all the way to Phoenix. But if we only look at New York, that number is 6.1 tons of CO2 per capita. 3 times less than the national average. Think about that the next time people tell you New York is unsustainable. It isn't. It might actually be the only sustainable place that we have in the United States. So I know you're probably expecting me to criticize LA, Atlanta, or Houston on the next slide. I'm going to go to a place that might be even worse than any of those areas, and that's Phoenix. As far as a bad example here, Phoenix, the bird on fire, the city in the desert, it devotes half HALF, caps lock. I should have bolded that and italicized and underlined it because of how outrageous that is. Half of its water use to irrigating lawns. This blew my mind when I was first out there. Like first time I ever went out to Scottsdale, which is a very wealthy suburb on the outskirts of Phoenix. You drive through Scottsdale and everybody's got this nice, pretty green lawn. And that leads me to ask, are we losing our goddamn minds? Green lawns in Arizona, a place where grass will not grow naturally. We want to have green lawns, and they're going to have green lawns. And that's to say nothing about the golf courses, which also divert a tremendous amount of water use. Are we losing our minds? Like, water is water is the single most important natural resource on Earth. It's not oil. It's not anything else, not coal. It's no fossil fuel. No, it's water. And Phoenix's use of it is one of the reasons why I often say, wipe it out. It doesn't deserve to exist, right? If they could be water sustainable in the desert, then fine. But they have shown no ability to do that. As a counterexample, you can have a large city in the suburbs or in the desert, pardon me, and be much more water sustainable. And look no further than Las Vegas, which I admit I don't like Las Vegas, but I don't despise it either. And that's because Las Vegas was barely populated at the time that the agreements of what people got from the Colorado River were signed. That was signed about a century ago. So LA, Phoenix, San Diego, like all these cities in the Southwest are now drawing a portion of the flow of the Colorado River based on what their population was in like 1913 or something like that, a long time ago. And Vegas barely existed at that point. So Vegas only gets, if my understanding is correct, about 2% of the Colorado River's outflow. And as a result, it has forced Las Vegas to become one of the most water efficient places in the country. But it doesn't extend any further than that because they still travel everywhere. They still have to use a tremendous amount of air conditioning, but they do tremendous things with recycling water and very, very effective and efficient use of the water that they have. I look at Vegas and it doesn't make me feel like we're losing our minds. I look at Phoenix and it does make me feel like we're losing our minds. All right, so now let's move on to the third part of that flow chart. Urban outputs. So what are the byproducts, right? The waste and the pollution that is associated with maintaining that way of life, maintaining consumption. We know, unfortunately, that wealthy areas tend to throw away the most. They tend to be the most wasteful because if you can only afford the bare minimum, you're going to be pretty careful about how you use that. Like almost out of financial necessity will lead you to environmental rationing. But it's also kind of an infrastructure issue. So one of the dirtiest cities I have ever seen in my life is Mumbai, India. Mumbai creates 10,000 tons of waste every single day and has almost no infrastructure for its collection. So everywhere I look, like India is just one of the dirtiest places I've ever seen. And people have to live in that stuff. Like people have to live in that environment because it doesn't really get picked up. A lot of it just gets thrown on the side of the road. And you have no idea how many massive trash heaps I saw and sometimes walked past in various parts of Mumbai. Another place where you see this is in Asia, where many of these cities have grown really dramatically and the living standard has gone way up in recent years. Jakarta, which maybe is a city you've never heard of. Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia, and Jakarta lacks any kind of waste pickup. So what do people do with their trash? They just throw it in the water, which means you're a lot better off being upstream than downstream. And what this has done is it's created a lot of demand. All of the wealthy people in Jakarta have like bought up land and built places to live upstream. and the people living in the urban slums of Jakarta end up being downstream, kind of living just downstream of everybody's waste and everybody's garbage. And so it's a water cleanliness issue. It's a public health issue. It's everything. So part of it is also like, just what do you do with this waste? Because all societies will produce it. Do you have a way to deal with that? Do you have a way to limit that? And do you have a plan for how to limit it? So as an example here, let's look at San Francisco. All the way back in 2002, so coming up on 20 years ago, San Francisco developed a plan to divert 100% of its waste from landfills. They wanted to go true zero waste. Everything would be consumed, or it would be recycled, or it would be biodegraded. Like however you end up, they didn't want anything in landfills. And they're actually 80% of the way there, right? You can see this on this graph here. In the United States, about 35% of waste is diverted from landfills. In Germany, a pretty good rate, that's 62%. In Berlin, a city that is known for being pretty ecologically friendly, it's only 40%. San Francisco, it's 80%. This is really remarkable project. And you don't have to be a hippy dippy environmentalist to feel that way. Like, do you want to live around a bunch of trash? Do you want to have giant landfills? It's a public health and like an infrastructure issue for everybody that almost everybody can agree upon. And in San Francisco, 80% of their stuff ends up not in a landfill. That's remarkable. And it happened through additive policy. There's no one thing you can do that will limit things going to landfill. There's a bunch of little things on the ground that can add up to that 80% rate there. So one of the things, San Francisco has gone to mandatory composting. So do you know how, like, if you live in my apartment, like the city has provided for me and for all of my neighbors, we are given a garbage can and we are given a recycling bin. And, collection comes once a week. I'm responsible for bringing it out to the curb. But the city has provided the bin for me. In San Francisco, every resident gets a composting bin. And they've gone mandatory with that. Like, everybody gets a composting bin, and a lot of people do use it. It's just part of what you get when you live in San Francisco. I will admit that as part of being cooped up and stir crazy a little bit through my placement in this quarantine, like my own self-isolation, I have been considering starting a compost in my backyard. It's a very small backyard, but it's a yard. And so I've been thinking about going to a composting, and that's just me being bored and needing something to do. Although there might be effects if an entire city of 700,000 people all do it, which is what you have seen in San Francisco. They banned plastic bags well before anybody else did, so they cut down on all that plastic in landfills. Just a side story on this. So I've only been to India once in my life, spent about a month there, and I was in Mumbai, one of the world's like an Asian mega city, on the day that their ban of plastic bags went into effect, and it was absolute chaos. I've never seen the markets or any market quite like that. That day because what India tends to do is they pass laws without really any sense of how it'll be implemented. So the government of India says, all right, plastic bags are banned. And actually, I don't think it was an India-wide thing. I think it was just Maharashtra, which is the state of India that Pune and Mumbai are in, two cities with several million residents each. And so the banning of these plastic bags there created a lot of economic and social chaos because there was no plan for how people were going to shop from that point on. All sorts of industrial incentives to not produce waste, right? Essentially, if you incentivize good behavior, even among those corporations, some of them will go on and do what is socially responsible in that way. We certainly hope, at least. And there are discounts. If you are in San Francisco and you skip 2 trash pickups each month, there's a discount, right? You get a discount on some type of tax. I forget what it is, property tax, or maybe whatever it is that's funding waste collection. You get a discount on that. And so that what they're doing, they're incentivizing kind of economic behavior, personal behavior, corporate behavior. It all adds up to a really remarkable diversion, recycling, reusing of things, biodegradable things. People, when they are properly incentivized, they will change their behavior, but it's got to be a non-hippie reason. Like you can't just say, hey, let's all just take care of Mother Nature. Those policies are often, unfortunately, doomed to failure. All right, so to review here on sustainable cities, urban sustainability requires planning in the process. That's where you need to plan a process that will efficiently use inputs and will limit the wasteful outputs. That's how cities become sustainable. And that is how we will defeat climate change, or not get defeated by it. Perhaps it's too late to say we'll defeat climate change. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that we can maybe fight it to a 12-round draw. I'll just ask you, what society do you want to be? Do you want to be in an unsustainable environment, or do you want to be in a sustainable environment? We all want to think long-term, but life incentivizes us to think short-term. And that's where public policy must pick up the slack. The very last thing, I always find a way to work this into any lecture I give about some element of the environment. You may not be familiar with the term tipping points. Tipping points is a scientific, or it's a social scientific as well, concept. It's basically the point in which the Jenga tower falls over. It's the point in a complex system where you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to use a different analogy. What you're seeing in these pictures, it's an image. The one on the left, the blue bubble, that's the world's fresh water supply. The pink bubble on the right, that's the world's oxygen supply. The only point I'm trying to make about this is that you don't need to change a lot to change the whole goddamn thing. Hopefully that doesn't depress you. Hopefully that helps you understand that we all have a part to play in this, okay? And we all have a part to play in creating public systems that reflect our will to survive into the future and our will to give our children a planet that will also take care of them the way that it is taking care of you and me. Thank you very much. Continue to send those project outlines to me, and I will continue to return feedback to you. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your Monday. Talk to you Wednesday.